President Yellen and fellows of the college. It's a really great honor and privilege and pleasure to be the keynote speaker today. And I kind of, I'm going to do the Canadian thing and apologize first. I kind of changed the title a tiny bit as I was finalizing the presentation, because it struck me that coming to talk about obligations might seem a little dry, so I changed it into something about challenges and opportunities. As President Yellen has indicated, I kind of traverse the zone between primary care and public health. My specialty is in public health. And in the next 40 minutes, I'm going to reflect a little bit about what I've learned in terms of the relationship between ethics and medical practice. It's been part of my academic life and my professional life since I commenced. So I wasn't asked to put up disclosure slides, but our colleges often require that we put up any conflicts of interests or any relationships with commercial interests. I have none. In terms of conflicts of interest, I like to say I don't have any conflicts of interest, but I do have many conflicts with interests, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we move through. And of course, being a good Canadian, I want to apologize beforehand. So the one thing we know about Canadians is they're notorious for their politesse, for saying they're sorry quite a lot. We're the only people that you know you're Canadian as opposed to an American when you see us saying thank you to an ATM machine. So I'll apologize in advance if this presentation doesn't live up to your expectations. I've already apologized for slightly changing the title. And now on with what I would like to speak about. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the major contribution that Australian scholars have made to medical ethics. Some of them are in this room, I believe, but substantial, vibrant, and active intellectual community, very large centers of medical ethics involved in research, and their work is very influential in Canada. I think there's a nice parity of interest between Canada and Australia, both being former colonies. Both of us, it's kind of interesting being a Canadian living north of what is an increasingly strange political environment, but we also share the same kind of legacies. We have a Royal College. I bring greetings from the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. So we have a lot of the influence of the British Empire in our structures of education. When I walk through the streets of Melbourne, I notice that the street names are very similar, but also the statuary has the same personages that you would find if you walk through the streets of Toronto. So it's always nice to acknowledge the contributions of Australia to medical ethics. I think like Canadians, they call it the tall poppy syndrome. We don't like to celebrate the excellence in our midst. It's always nice to sort of give credit to others, but those of you in the Royal Australasian College of Physicians who are involved in ethics and ethics research should be proud of your contributions to medical ethics. So the overview, I'm going to start with some more or less personal reflections to kind of set the stage. I'm also going to talk about medical codes of ethics. So the Canadian Medical Association is in the midst of revising its code of ethics, and I was voluntold to be part of this process. And as a consequence of this, I've been reflecting upon medical codes of ethics and had the opportunity to actually read every code of ethics and every revision since 1868. So we're coming up to the 150th anniversary of the Canadian Medical Association, which does writes the codes of ethics, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to highlight 5 what I think are emerging challenges, and they may not seem prima facie to be ethical challenges, but I'm going to argue that in fact they cross-cut and have significant implications for how we practice medicine across all of the specialties, including primary care. And then some thoughts toward the future about how we might better integrate ethics into our daily professional lives. So these 2 pictures depict, one at the top is McMaster University Medical Center. I trained in medicine at McMaster. I graduated in 1986. At that time, you can see it was a state-of-the-art building. It was one of the many architectural awards. And at that time, it was an experimental school. No other medical faculty in the world would admit someone like myself who had 2 degrees in philosophy into medicine. They were focusing on admitting candidates to medical school that they thought had unique characteristics and qualities to be good problem solvers rather than people who scored well on standardized exams. As you know, McMaster has become famous for the evolution of what's now known as evidence-based medicine, but it didn't exist at that time. And I was greatly fortunate to have Dr. David Sackett as my mentor throughout that. And he insisted on the importance of engaging with the evidence, particularly randomized control trials. But I very quickly, down on the right is the picture of the rural hospital that I worked at. The white stuff there is snow. I understand you don't see a lot of that in Melbourne, and you should be glad of that you don't have to shovel it on regular occasions. But immediately you can see a small 20-bed rural hospital is in many ways, in lots of ways, unlike a tertiary care academic health sciences center. And having to adapt what you've learned in medical school to the practice in a rural farming community indicates a couple of interesting things that I think cross-cut all areas of practice. One is you can see there's disparities in technology, disparities in access to specialist services. And when you're training in tertiary care environments, you get used to the fact that you've got very competent specialists in surgery and medicine if you run into trouble. What I found out very early on in my practice in a rural hospital is I was the gastroenterologist, the cardiologist, the surgeon. I was everything because you knew that if you disturbed any of the specialists for anything that was not deemed to be of great consequence, they would never take your consultations again. If we needed blood work done, we had to turn on the Coulter counter and run it ourselves. And the interesting thing on weekends on call, if you needed any sort of assistance with radiology, you had to find the radiology technologist. And of course, during harvest season, that was virtually impossible, because this was in the day before, broad access to cell phones, and so you had to phone the farm, hope somebody was there. They would get somebody to chase out into the back 40 where they were doing the threshing, and then eventually they'd come in. So eventually you learned just to turn on the X-ray machine and do it for yourself. So I learned a lot about clinical medicine and its limitations, and about disparities of access. And this is not just the case in high-income countries like in Canada and the United States and Australia, but on a global scale is of great consequence. So for the younger physicians in the audience, this is not going to be a talk about the good old days, what it was like then, but it's interesting. And congratulations to all of the new fellows, by the way. It was wonderful to walk through the halls of the convention center and see all of the gowns and all of the family and the great spirit and happiness that abounded. But I'm bringing this up to indicate that we all enter the practice of medicine within a historical horizon that shapes our understanding of what is possible. It also shapes to a certain extent what we think our obligations are and what our ethical obligations are. So in 1986, having trained at McMaster, knowing that I had to do literature searches for every well-formed question for every patient that I saw, but there were no computers. Everything was paper. There was no internet. There was no social media. Evidence-based medicine hadn't been invented yet. It was still just clinical epidemiology and critical appraisal. The genome wasn't sequenced. There wasn't statins. HIV was just recognized as an important pathogen, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on with all of the things that have changed from then until now, with some predictable and some unpredictable consequences. But I want to direct us to the past, because some of the central tasks of a physician are eternal. And of course, most of our ethical thinking has its origins, to a certain extent, in the Hippocratic tradition. And I want to start with a quotation and an observation from Hippocrates. Hippocrates indicated that the doctor should declare what has happened before, understand what is present, and foretell what will happen in the future. In fact, if you read the Hippocratic writings, which are actually still rich and relevant today, he makes a point that what distinguishes a physician from all other healers, and there were many healing schools in antiquity, was the fact that physicians were able to prognosticate. And prognosis, and accurate prognosis, is what gave the patient the trust in the physician. So that is what he should practice. As to diseases, he should strive to achieve two things, and this is an important point to recognize: to help, firstly, or to do no harm. Many people, and you read this, say, the first axiom of medical ethics is primum non nocere, do no harm. But if you look at this, actually that's not what Hippocrates is saying? He's saying that the first impulse of a physician is beneficence, to try to help. The second one is non-maleficence, to try not to harm. The other very important observation that Hippocrates makes about the practice of medicine is that the task of a physician is to distinguish what is particular to each individual patient and to find the commonality that resides in. And this, to me, indicates, one, you could say, well, this is kind of patient-centered, respect for persons in some way, but it actually focuses on one of the most important obligations of a physician, which is to have excellent judgment of the particular case and to link that to the generalities that we have across science and ethics. So I'm going to return to this at the end because I think from the distant past, and most of us in the room would recognize, yes, that's what we do. We try to help patients, we try not to harm them, and we try to figure out what's unique to each of our patients in front of us and draw upon the generalities and the universals of knowledge to apply to that patient. So not much has changed. I also just want to reorient ourselves to what the overarching goals of medicine are in and of themselves. So as mentioned in the introduction, I do have a profound interest in the philosophy of medicine and in ethics. So there's epistemology, which is how we think about what we know and what constitutes legitimate claims to knowledge, and how we use that to actually affect the good in our patients. So in my view, the epistemic and the ethical are not very far removed. In fact, they're deeply intertwined. So this relates to some of the goals of medicine. So what are we supposed to do when we practice as physicians? Well, we're supposed to preserve health and well-being by promoting health, preventing disease, treating illness, curing illness, minimizing suffering and distress, and also working in some way to assure the health of the community. So this is what we are tasked to do and obliged to do when we take on the role and are given the privilege of being a physician with the ability to practice medicine and interact and influence the lives of our patients. So a little bit about medical ethics and codes of ethics. As I mentioned, I've been working on the revision of the Canadian Medical Association Code of Ethics. I did have the great pleasure of reading the Australian Medical Ethics Code of Ethics, and you've just kind of revised it. So the interesting to note, they have ancient lineage. I've already indicated that some argue they go back to the Hippocratean corpus. Almost all national medical associations have their own code of ethics or endorse the World Medical Association Code of Ethics. However, it's unclear the extent to which these codes of ethics have any influence on physicians practicing. If you look at the empirical literature, for example, if you survey physicians and ask them if they actually access the code of ethics, it's a rather dispiriting set of data for those who are involved in the writing of codes of ethics. It's unclear whether codes of ethics are actually taught in any significant way to medical students and postgraduate trainees. And it seems as we move into our professional lives, there's not a lot of access to the code. So for example, we had just sent out a survey to the large membership of the Canadian Medical Association, asking them about their engagement with the Code of Ethics. So there's a heavy non-response bias, of course. Physicians are notoriously difficult to research and engage through surveys. But of the respondents, about 70% said they never or seldom read or engage with the Code of Ethics. So we might ask ourselves, is this some kind of ritual? We have it there, it's there, but we don't actually engage with it. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So codes of ethics have kind of as a genre of writing, they have a very set structure. They typically specify the obligations of the physician to patients, to their peer physicians, to the profession, and society. They do evolve through time and through serial revision. If you think they're like the 10 Commandments and they have these kind of eternal statements, you would be sorely mistaken. They are in no way fixed or eternal. And they often reflect pressing issues related to external pressures on medicine. So interestingly, when radio came as a technology, it was obviously a very disruptive technology because for several years and for several revisions provisions of the Canadian Medical Association Code of Ethics, it had very clear language about how physicians were to interact on the radio, whether they should be on the radio, and if they were on the radio, what sort of things should they say. There's an immense amount of time when reproductive technologies came in where there was very specific language around, for example, abortion. Interestingly, the idea that a patient had rights did not emerge in the Code of Ethics in Canada until the 1970s. So just for some amusement, I'm going to just walk through a couple of interesting codes. So the original code in 1868 was fascinating. Not only did it have what our obligations to patients were, there were 10 articles of patients' obligations to the patient, to the physicians, which was lovely. You know, don't call them in the middle of the night if you don't have to. And so I like this first one. A patient should never weary his physician with a tedious detail of events or matters not appertaining to their disease. How many clinicians wish they could hold up this code of ethics and say, the obedience, get this, the obedience of a patient to the prescriptions of his physician should be prompt and implicit. So to say that there is a certain paternalistic streak to this code of ethics would be a bit of an understatement. Of course, it's only in the 1868 Code of Ethics that there is this provision that there are actually obligations of the patient to the physician correlative to our obligations to them. The other interesting thing is that from 1868 to 1928, there was a provision, and then again, they were still talking about when infectious diseases were quite prominent and one of the most common causes of morbidity and mortality. We still haven't ended infectious diseases, as we know from our experience with Ebola, Zika, influenza, et cetera, et cetera. But this was interesting, and this became part of the work I did with the World Health Organization in the early aughts, where I chaired the Committee on Physicians' Obligations during a pandemic. One of the issues is, how much risk should an individual physician take in caring for a patient who may, in fact, infect them with a lethal illness? This became a bit of an issue in the late 80s and early 90s with HIV, and there's been a lot of discourse and discussion around how physicians set their limit of engagement in terms of the taking of risks when they may become ill. I could spend a whole hour talking about this. It's a fascinating topic. But the interesting thing was, for several years, the Code of Ethics in Canada said, when pestilence is upon the people, it is the physician's duty to continue their work for the alleviation of suffering, even at the jeopardy of their own lives. Now, some may argue that's too steep a cost to pay for being a physician. We can, over the next few days, discuss whether this should still, we were wondering when we were sitting at the World Health Organization in Geneva, whether we should put this back in as an obligation for physicians. It was fascinating. Philosophers believe that, you should actually be able to set a clear level of risk at which physicians should be able to engage with their patients. And I said, well, that's very interesting, because I'm not really aware the last time a philosopher has actually had to care for a patient who is secreting large amounts of virus when the healthcare system that you're working for is unable to provide sufficient personal protective equipment. So that's an interesting and still alive issue. And finally, I thought there's an interesting dynamic and dialectic between the amount of content in the Code of Ethics that specify physicians' obligations to society. In 1938, we were here on the eve of World War II, the pestilence provision was evacuated, and inserted into this was every physician, whatever his special training. And note, the early language of these codes is all about him, because at that time medicine was a largely male profession, so we'll have to be careful about our language going forward, but should officially or unofficially be a servant of the state for the betterment of health. This has some very interesting implications for physician independence from the state itself. So, medical ethics, my reflections. I've been involved in the teaching and scholarship and research in medical ethics since actually before I went into medical school. I think it still continues to be poorly taught in the undergraduate and postgraduate context. And the hidden curriculum predominates. So the hidden curriculum is what our trainees, as they're in their undergraduate and in their postgraduate training, see. It's what they talk about. It's how they understand what obligations are by viewing what the physicians they're working for portray. So the other empirical literature seems to indicate that trainees' ethical sensitivity tends to diminish through their training, largely because of what they're watching and seeing. So to have somebody come in and give a lecture on the 4 principles of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, to expatiate at length on the codes of ethics, seems to have very little effect on people's understanding of their ethical obligations. There also seems to be very little engagement at the level of continuing professional development. And as noted, I've been the chair of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons Ethics Committee. Actually, my term just ended after serving 2 terms, but I still remain on the committee. We have built a huge curriculum that serves all of the, I think we have 68 recognized specialties and subspecialties. We have cases, we have primers, we have no shortage of information available that you can actually claim for your continuing professional development credits, but it seems to be accessed very little. So I've been trying to push for a more engaging strategy. Should we have podcasts? Should we have various different ways rather than cases? There seems to be very little uptake. The other side of this in the profession itself is that ethics as an independent concern for physicians seems to be being eclipsed by professionalism. So for example, in the programs that I built when I was at the Joint Center for Bioethics, we had a very large program that was dedicated to making sure that all of the Royal College programs had ethics education. In fact, we started a specific master's degree, professional master's degree in bioethics because of accreditation pressures. The Royal College said, "Thou shalt teach bioethics," and when they came through to do the accreditation of the programs, they were expecting to see meaningful ethics education in the curriculum. So we worked hard. We had 2 surgeons actually lead up our postgraduate medical education. We had trained a large number of specialists to come and become the ethics champions. It's one of the things we learned is that physician leadership in ethics education is absolutely crucial. There seems to be little uptake if you have somebody outside the profession coming in and teaching it. So we were training on average about 10 to 15 specialists a year that would go back to their universities and become the leads in their Royal College accredited programs. And then somewhere in the early mid-aughts, it was decided that it really wasn't about ethics, it was about professionalism. So they stopped the funding for the postgraduate ethics training. And I kept going and saying, well, you know, there might be something confusing here. How is professionalism not about ethics? You say you're talking about the values of the profession, et cetera, et cetera. So that might be something that we can discuss further. So we're living in a changing world. I could spend the whole talk about aging and chronic diseases. Just before I left to come here, on the front page of the Globe and Mail, the major national newspaper in Canada, showed the results from the latest census that showed for the first time the number of people in Canada over the age of 65 is greater than that under the age of 18. So we have a dependency ratio. And with that comes a large number of chronic diseases. My particular clinical interest in clinical research is on multimorbidity, aging, and frailty, and how we build systems of care that are able to best respond to these. I think multimorbidity provides a very interesting challenge for specialty medicine. It's really interesting when you're trying to figure out whether the lead physician should be a cardiologist, a nephrologist, a rheumatologist, and many of the patients that I see have sometimes 9 specialists involved in their care. And this will become a problem not just within high-income countries where the dependency ratio we know in Japan is quite high. I think Australia has similar demographics to Canada, but it's around the world. I think it's estimated that by 2025 there will be some 400 million people in China over the age of 65. So I want you to keep this aging and multimorbidity as a cross-cutting challenge for health systems. I'm going to talk a little bit more about big data in the context of information ethics. Quality and accountability for performance has become a very important strain in medicine, practice organization, how we pay for medicine, how physicians are paid. I'm going to come to globalization a little bit more, and I think there's going to be a particular session later on how we as physicians engage with the social determinants. As a public health physician, I realize that the social, environmental, and broader determinants of health often have a greater shaping force on morbidity and mortality and quality of life than anything that we can do through the healthcare system. And the more that we as physicians start to take on some of the challenges associated with social determinants, I think the better off we'll be. So here are the 5 key challenges that I want to just go over. And the ethics may be latent or obvious. I'm going to talk a lot about technology first because I think it's the one that's fast upon us, particularly information technology, interprofessionalism, intraprofessionalism, globalization, and medicine itself. I think we have some interesting challenges to face. This is a very thoughtful essay. It's called Meaning and the Nature of Physicians' Work. If you know the writing of Abraham Verghese, he's a very eloquent writer, a very thoughtful and perceptive writer. And what they're talking about there is how technology has changed the very face of how we as physicians work. So technology has introduced a certain amount of complexity. There is a huge volume of information on the internet about health, and this democratization of health information poses very particular challenges for physicians. Going back to those bucolic days when I was a clinician in the farming town, when a farmer showed up in my office during the day, particularly during harvest season, I didn't need to ask if something was seriously wrong. I knew something was wrong, because that's why he was sitting there. And inevitably when I would ask, "Whoa, nice to see you, why are you here today?" "Well, the wife sent me." "Okay, good, we've got something to go from." And it would take hours to pull out the information in their own words. They're taciturn, and anybody who's worked with farmers know they have more creative ways of harming themselves than you would ever believe. But the words were the patient's words, which formed the history which allowed us to do a differential diagnosis. Now, working in a downtown urban environment, my patients, of course, have diagnosed themselves. They come in with, a whack of stuff. They put everything that they experience into the search engine, and they just come and say, "This is what you need." So I become a healthcare waiter. So now I have to undiagnose to diagnose. Social media, patients form support groups. I tell my residents, wherever you are at the checkout, always look at the magazines. That's where you learn what people are thinking. That's what's shaping their preference. It's always 10 life-saving, interventions your doctor doesn't know about or is withholding from you. So there's an increasing challenge to our expertise with this democratization of health information. Again, back to the 80s, if people had a Merck manual, that might be the only health information that they had access to. We were the ones who were the experts, and that's why they came to us. And now there's a variety of groups, not just physicians, but allied health professions, complementary and alternative care providers, who all have access to this and all have claims about what is best for their patients. The other thing about technology is it poses very strong and challenging issues around resource allocation. How much investment do we put in high tech, whether that be genomics, information technology, as opposed to the supports that we need for our patients in the community? And of course, there's a kind of inbuilt perversity to information technology, because as soon as you get a system installed, it needs upgrading or it's been superseded by some new format. So I have nothing but respect for the chief information officer at any complex health organization. They have a very daunting task. The other thing is that the increase in health applications. There's now 165,000 health applications that you can download from either iTunes Store or from Google Store, and none of them are actually tested in any way. Actually, a lot of them are just platforms for grabbing metadata. So I like this joke, I'm sorry, the doctor no longer makes diagnoses. So So when we converted to an electronic patient record, I just want to give you the view of the world from the information technology side of the equation. I'm going to speak about this for the next couple of minutes. Interestingly, you'll notice, so we've talked about physician-centered care, and that's not the way it should be. We need to be more person-centered. This is server-centered care. So you can see at the middle of this entire enterprise is the server. And I like it if you see out over to the right is clinicians seeing patients, but they're not looking at the patient at all. They're looking at the screen. At least the physicians there, the clinicians, are depicted as in a somewhat human resemblance, but the patient is just a little kind of stub with a circle on top. And you can see all around. So this is the view from the IT world. Now, you may have noticed in the last year there's been an increased amount of attention to artificial intelligence, machine learning, and deep learning. This is fast upon us. The University of Toronto is one of the largest centers of artificial intelligence research in the world. In fact, one of their senior faculty is now working with Google because he created the algorithm that was a big breakthrough for actually mining data. I was asked to be part of a panel on The Robot Will See You Now. So it was me, I was the only clinician, 3 computer scientists, and it's very interesting how confident they are that we will no longer be required very shortly. And when you think of it, companies with huge amounts of money, Google, Amazon, Apple, IBM, are all investing large sums of money to invest in diagnostics and smart algorithms and all sorts of things that will actually command their attention. So at the end of it, after hearing them, I said, this is really good. I'm glad to hear that the computers, the robots are going to displace us. I said, if I get you correct, you're going to be able to put all of your symptoms into a search engine, and then with some sort of point-of-care diagnostic technology, you can get some blood and it will feed into that. Then you go to your drive-through MRI and you can get a total body MRI, and all this information will spit out to the patient their own diagnosis, and then they can go to the treatment center and pick up off the shelf what they want. I said, this is wonderful. Now you will own your own malpractice because, of course, So there's a lot of claims being made about how artificial intelligence is going to transform, our daily lives. There's also a lot of claims to how big data is going to transform our understanding. So I cheekily call this the linkome, and you don't have to read all of this, but it just indicates all of the different varieties of sources of data that are patient relevant that soon will be able to be linked. So they're considered, it's called a tapestry of potentially high value information sources, everything from personal health records all the way through to social media. The idea that you can harness this, and with machine learning, artificial intelligence, you can kind of figure out new horizons of disease and disease transmission. The implications for the new technology, this is a quotation from the Emmanuel paper, is that machine learning will displace much of the work of radiologists and anatomical pathologists. And just to this point, when the University of Toronto was given $135 million for a new center on artificial intelligence, with the first aim of actually improving our capacity to diagnose, I was listening, they had a panel on the radio, and it went from artificial intelligence is almost as good as physicians to as good to better in 3 sentences. And I found this deeply disquieting. Before they'd even got to be as good as us, they were already better than us, and you could see everybody celebrating the end of physicians. So, lots of claims, and I've been around as a clinician long enough. I usually have, at this time, introduced the hover car. So when I was young in popular mechanics, the Jetsons was a popular cartoon, and everybody had cars that flew everywhere. And I like to say, well, I'm in my late 50s now, and I still don't have a flying car. We started a war on cancer in the 60s. As far as I know, we're still working on that. So there's a lot of overblown claims about what artificial intelligence is going to do for medicine. And I think a lot of it believes that a lot of the relationships in patient care are simply linear and not complex. We claim that they're going to lead us to have more efficient care, and I don't know if anybody in the room has believed that I won't say electronic medical records. I like to joke that there's 3 great eras in human evolution. There's the creation of the wheel, the taming of fire, and the advent of electronic medical records. The interesting thing is, in Ontario, we have 21 of them, and they're not interoperable. None of them can connect with the hospital systems, and we spent several $billions, and we've actually gotten very little far. So I'll believe a lot of this when I see it. It probably will have some implications for research, but there's also a downside to this. The larger number of data points you have, the more you can find associations that have no meaning other than they've got a lot of p-values. And of course, the larger the number of observations you have, the more statistically significant associations you can find, and we need to think about what that means. But the important issue here is the idea of the hollowing out of cognitive labor, of physician labor. We all know large sectors of employment have been completely displaced by robotics and technology. So they talk about this as the 4th industrial revolution, and the idea that this has created technological unemployment, and I think it is actually a fairly real risk for us going forward. And I'm going to move to my second point on interprofessionalism. A couple of years back, the Lancet published this Health Professionals for the New Century, Transforming Education to Strengthen Health Systems in an Interdependent World. This was meant to be the Flexner report for the 21st century. Julio Frank, who was at that time the Dean of the Harvard School of Public Health, David Naylor, who was our Dean and President, many deans of many major medical schools were part of this report. It's high level, they call this the 3rd generation reforms, is that all health professionals in all countries should be educated to mobilize knowledge, engage in critical reasoning and ethical conduct so that they are competent to participate in patient and population-centered health systems. The other thing that this report is very strong on is that all care in the future will be delivered through team-based approaches. In fact, they recommend that teaching in teams start at the undergraduate level and carry through. I joke about this is that, of course, we're all going to need to be applied philosophers because we're going to have to be critical reasoners and we're going to have to be ethical at the same time. That notion that the ethical and the epistemic are very closely related. Interestingly, I think it was a little brief on its notion of what ethics were, and with a colleague, Sali Benatar, we wrote a paper on what we thought the appropriate ethics in the 21st century ought to be. So interprofessional ethics. So healthcare is increasingly becoming team-based, and it's no longer clear that the physician is always the most appropriate lead clinician. I work in a rehab environment now with complex patients with multiple needs. Oftentimes it may be the occupational therapist, the physiotherapist, or the social worker that probably has the most to say about the appropriate model of care. This has led now to what I'll broadly call boundary wars about the scope of practice. This is something that actually has been present in the codes of ethics through their evolution. When hospital-based care became the norm for medicine in Canada, soon into the codes of ethics became a large number of statements about how we as physicians are to work with nurses, how we're to work with hospital authorities. And so now we know there's a multiplicity of health professions. We do a poor job of educating healthcare professionals in team-based care, and the way in which we pay attention to team-based ethics is really underdeveloped. So I see that as something that we need to give some concerted effort to. Intraprofessional ethics, that's our obligations to peers and to the profession itself. And that's been a common theme also throughout codes of ethics over the years. Recently, though, it's interesting, the emphasis that as physicians we have an obligation for self-care. And I cannot overestimate this enough as we've seen levels of mental health and distress in trainees, burnout in clinicians, that we have an obligation to keep ourselves well. but also how we work with other clinicians and how we work with senior clinicians, how we talk about what I call intergenerational issues. So I was asking earlier whether there were issues in Australia with employability of physicians. It's actually become a bit of an issue in Canada, as many fellowship-trained clinicians are not practicing. I think the level I heard at the health policy meeting that I attended just before the college before I came here is about 10 to 13% of graduated fellows are not practicing optimally in the practice that they were trained for. And the issue also about clinicians not retiring and making room for new clinicians to come in and build up their referral practice. So the governance of the profession is interesting as well. Canada has the most prolix and complicated relationship between the colleges of physicians and surgeons, the Royal College, the College of Family Physicians, the provincial territorial medical associations, the regulatory authorities, the medical schools, the subspecialty societies. For one, if we're supposed to be unified as one profession, it's really quite a rat's nest of relationships and interests that don't always get along as well as they should. And moral conflict, and I think this has already been alluded to in the opening comments. So Canada did pass a law on assisted dying and euthanasia. It is now legal in Canada. I had spent a lot of time trying to get the Royal College proactively engaged. Before it was at the Supreme Court, any good betting person would have realized that the decision of the court was going to be permissive. I thought there was an opportunity to get ahead of the curve because it actually fundamentally changes the relationship of the physician to the patient in a most profound way. Because hitherto, all of the governance documents, all of the policy documents said to physicians, thou shalt not engage in any way in assisting patients to die. I published a commentary in The Lancet about some of the unresolved issues in Canada's law on physician-assisted dying. I could spend like 2 hours talking about this because I've been actively involved in this process for some time, and I'm now on a subcommittee. The law that in Canada left 3 populations outside its ambit: adolescents and children, people with persistent mental health illness, and advanced directives for people with cognitive impairment. So I'm now on another national committee trying to solve some of these issues. But one of the things that has struck me is that there is a huge divergence, and in fact a fair cleavage in the physician population about this. And so collegiality demands that we respect each other's divergent moral views. But it's not straightforward by any stretch of the imagination, and there's little in our training that prepares us as physicians for addressing these issues in relationships with each other and patients, as well as all of the allied health professions. And one of the interesting things in the introduction of medical assistance in dying is that we didn't think about all of the people who might be involved in the care. We didn't think that the person who brought food to the person ought to be informed of the decision. And early on in the experience of our hospital with assisted dying is that one of the persons who was most dramatically affected because they didn't know what was going to happen was the person who brought the meal to that patient every day, and one day they disappeared. The other thing that's interesting is schedules of work. For example, we're used to in academic training centers that teams rotate on and off, and blue team or green team or team 1 or team 2 will go off. And on one of the early assisted dyings, the team turned over on the day of the actual assisted death. And when that occurred, the patient said, well, where is everybody that was caring for me? Does this mean that they're upset with me for making this decision? So there's a lot of wrinkles on the day-to-day practice that need to be thought through. I wish you good luck. Fourth theme, globalization. I've done a lot of work with global epidemics, influenza. I was deeply involved with SARS and Ebola. We now know that we live in an interconnected planet, and our obligations extend not just to the patients that we see, in our offices, but to patients remote from us as well. We know that climate change is going to change the epidemiology of health. If you're a climate change denier, you won't believe that, but if you're an acceptor, you will accept that there might be some changes in the epidemiology of diseases and our capacity. We might need more surge capacity, we might need more emergency training, and we might need to think about how clinicians work with public health for disasters. We also know, for example, the overarching importance of poverty, and I know you've got a particular session on social determinants of health and how physicians can make a difference in the world, and I think these are some of the key issues. And the last one there is about antimicrobial resistance, and I think physicians have a very strong, and specialist physicians have a strong role to play in helping to curb that problem. So I just lead this here and underdeveloped because I know you've got a particular session on this coming up. But medicine itself has its own interesting twists and turns. It no longer has a unitary vision, and I've been spending the last 2 years working on a book on philosophy of medicine, and in the final chapter I asked the question, whither medicine? So we have all of these. When I went to medicine, there was just medicine. Now we've got evidence-based medicine, precision medicine, personalized medicine. These all sort of are oriented towards either the basic science. There's an interesting tension developing between evidence-based medicine and personalized medicine. In fact, there's a group in the UK called EBM+, which is arguing that you cannot actually understand a disease simply by having statistics. You need a mechanism, and if you have studied evidence-based medicine, you know that they put mechanism at the bottom of the hierarchy. So how we integrate these ways of thinking about health and disease and what kind of causal models we have actually inform the type of care that we will actually recommend to our patients. So it has some very particular ethical implications. On the other side, we have what I would call visions of medicine that are leaning more towards the humanistic side into the social sciences, values-based medicine, narrative medicine, person or patient-centered medicine. All of these are perceiving some kind of fundamental lack within these other visions because they're escaping the particularities of the person. So if you think back to my earlier invocation of Hippocrates and his idea that clinical judgment and wisdom is founded in understanding what is particular to each as well as the universalities, we ought to be thinking that these things are coexistent and actually need to be mutually reinforcing and mutually practiced. So how we get past this divide, I think, is an important ethical challenge for our profession. So the biggest challenge in the 21st century, will we still need physicians, and what sort of physician will they be? Will they be someone like Gregory House, who you probably all know, misanthropic, but man, he was a good diagnostician, and isn't that what physicians are supposed to be, good diagnosticians, by whatever means necessary, even if you have to break into somebody's house? The other interesting thing is this gentleman had all of the time in the world and all of the technology at his disposal. Or, you know, I actually went back and watched an episode of Marcus Welby, MD. He was kind of the avuncular generalist of the 1970s, and he knew all of his patients by name and their history. He was somebody who actually would have objected to that language in that 1868 Code of Ethics. He wanted to hear. He was not bored by any detail of a patient's life. So which kind of physician do we want to have? I'm going to conclude by talking about clinical judgment, which is something that I'm very interested in. And William Osler, when I graduated from medicine, William Osler is a Canadian physician. He was actually born close to where McMaster University Medical Center is. And there's a trust in Canada that gives every graduating medical student a book of Osler's writings. And of course, it seems rather fusty and ancient when you graduate. But when you get to my age and you start to read them, you go, geez, that guy was pretty insightful. This was a man who actually understood what it was like to practice medicine. And he claims that medicine is a science of uncertainty and an art of probability. And what I'm going to argue is our ethical obligation as clinicians are to be masters of what it means to practice with uncertainty. So let me unpack that a little bit. So I had spent about 15 years trying to embed in the undergraduate medical curriculum a lecture about epistemology and uncertainty. And I was told by the powers that be that this would be distressing to the medical students, that if they were told that they weren't infallible diagnosticians, that we would somehow be undermining their confidence. And I kept arguing this is nonsense. So I finally was able to get that lecture on the curriculum last year. And then beautifully, when it's in the New England Journal of Medicine or the New York Times, then you know you're correct. So there was an article on uncertainty in the area of precision medicine, basically claiming what we all know who have been in practice for a long time. There is a lot of uncertainty in the practice of medicine, and our capacity to manage that uncertainty and actually manage the patient at the same time is the highest task of the art of medicine. So what is uncertainty? There's a fabulous chapter in a handbook in philosophy of medicine called Clinical Uncertainty. And it talks about this kind of relationship between complete ignorance on the one hand and certainty on the other hand. But what it argues is that the type of knowledge that we work with in medicine always leaves what's on that far right side called epistemic irreducible uncertainty. It means no matter how much we try, there's always going to be a certain unresolved amount of uncertainty that we don't know about, and that is where we come into the fore. So science and scientific research is one manner in which we try to reduce uncertainty. And as clinicians, I think we're obliged as physicians to contribute to the advance of knowledge to serve our patients better. Uncertainty has various dimensions, and one stems from lack of knowledge when knowledge is available. And that's why we have this whole move towards knowledge translation. Evidence-based medicine actually was very strong. The one thing that I think the best thing I learned at McMaster was we have to keep learning. I tell when I lecture medical students, I say half of what you learn is going to be wrong within about 5 to 10 years of you graduating from practice. So you have an obligation to try to keep abreast of the literature. The more important sense of uncertainty relates to that incomplete knowledge. And research, again, tries to fill and reduce this incompleteness. And as a clinician researcher, I always find it difficult when we cannot get collaboration from our peers when we're trying to do some study that's going to actually help us manage patients better. So I think one thing for all of the young, newly graduated fellows, get involved in research and education. It's part of what it means to be a physician. It's part of what gives you a fulfilling career. So at the time decisions are required, appropriate evidence may not be available or there may not be agreement on its interpretation. And remarkably, R.A. Fisher, who's the statistician who formalized the mathematics of the randomized control trial, argued that the beautiful thing about a randomized control trial is that it would eliminate all arguments. In other words, you would know something, and this is clearly not the case in medicine because I've sat in many a room where learned scholars and senior clinicians argue quite heatedly about the implications and meaning of a well-designed clinical trial. So uncertainty is ineradicable in medicine. It's something that we will hold to ourselves. And Valerie Mike, who's a statistician, proposed the following 2 imperatives for an ethics of evidence, which I think will inform our practice. And one is kind of nicely tied to I'd say, the ambitions of knowledge translation, continuing professional development, evidence-based medicine. We have an obligation to create, disseminate, and use the best possible scientific evidence as a basis for every phase of medical decision-making. And we need to do that soundly grounded in our knowledge of the patient's preferences. So I think that's clear. But the other thing is we do need to be aware of and come to terms with the extent and ultimately irreducible nature of uncertainty. And this, again, where Hippocrates argued that the capacity to indicate prognosis is what gained trust, I think our ability to actually express and live with uncertainty is of high moral obligation. Let's be clear. There are many people out there, many other clinicians from various traditions, who have no problem being quite certain and dogmatic about the benefit they're going to bring towards their patients. And in one of my lectures I give to my medical students, I say, Google cure osteoarthritis. And you will find no shortage of people peddling cures to osteoarthritis. And you know that patients are going to be drawn to try those things because we really have very poor, it's a highly prevalent condition and people suffer from it. And we need to be able to protect our patients from the charlatans out there. Interestingly, back to those older codes of ethics, one of the obligations to society was to protect our patients from quackery. And that's kind of, it's a nice quaint term, but I think we do have an obligation to protect our patients. So ethics in medicine. Will codes of ethics make a difference? I'm not certain, but I'm still going to continue working with them. I think all of the educators in the room, we should actually be working with them. And when we talk about ethics, what type of ethics? Do we want to be principle-based, rely on the autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence framework? Or do we want to talk about virtue ethics? What are the qualities and characteristics of clinicians that we want to see? Will professionalism eclipse ethics? And most importantly, I think the challenge for all of us in the room is that our profession is based on, infused by, given its legitimacy by our moral authority and our commitment to ethics. And we need to live up to that to ensure the trust of not just the patients, but society in us. So Hippocrates famously argued, life is short, the art long, opportunity fleeting, experiment treacherous, and most importantly, judgment difficult. If machines replace us, then we've abdicated our judgment. I've had a very interesting study that I was part of which compared clinical judgment to some form of statistic or computer-aided diagnosis. And actually, guys, we're pretty good. Actually, physicians know what they're doing about, and we need to remember that. So I'm finished now, and hopefully we won't find this type of day where you can't list your iPhone as a primary care physician. Thank you for your time and attention. It's been a great delight and pleasure to be with you.